The metal smell hits his nostrils first. Kirk Douglas stands at the helicopter door, 74 years old, still traveling by chopper for film shoots like the old guard Hollywood legends always did. Early morning hours. The sun hasn't fully risen yet. The airfield's silent, except for the low hum of the rotor preparing to spin. The pilot gestures toward the back seat with a professional smile. Mr. Douglas, the rear seat is more comfortable, he says, his tone suggesting this isn't really a question. But Kirk looks at the front seat, imagines the view through the windshield, the open sky stretching before him. No, he says, his voice carrying that same decisiveness that made him Spartacus, that made him a force in an industry built on competing egos. I'm sitting up front. I want to see the sky. The two young passengers smile at each other, settling into the rear seats without hesitation. The helicopter lifts. Kirk stares out the window, watching clouds approach. And in 8 minutes, Kirk Douglas's life will change forever. But right now, in this moment, as the helicopter glides silently through the morning air, nobody knows. Nobody is ready. And Kirk Douglas doesn't yet understand what sitting in that front seat will mean. Before we continue with what happened that morning in February 1991, if you want to hear more stories about Hollywood's golden age and the untold moments that shaped legendary careers, make sure to subscribe to our channel. Now let's go back to that helicopter climbing into the California sky. Kirk Douglas woke up that morning the way he had woken up for decades. Early, disciplined, ready. When he arrived at the small airfield, the helicopter was already waiting. It wasn't a large aircraft, just a modest Bell 206, the kind used for short hops up and down the California coast. The pilot was a professional Kirk had flown with a few times before, a man whose name he knew, but whose face he couldn't quite place in the dim morning light. Two younger men were also waiting, passengers Kirk didn't know, probably businessmen heading to the same general area. They nodded politely at him. That particular nod people give when they recognize someone famous but don't want to make a scene about it. Kirk appreciated that. He had spent 50 years being recognized, and the older he got, the more he valued the moments when recognition came without performance. The pilot did his pre-flight check while Kirk stood near the open door, breathing in the cool air. That metal smell, sharp and industrial, mixed with aviation fuel and morning dew. He had flown in helicopters hundreds of times, maybe thousands, during the war years, during film shoots in remote locations, during rush trips between studios when time mattered more than comfort. It had never bothered him. Flying felt like control, like being above the mess of traffic and schedules and other people's agendas. Up there, in the air, you were either moving forward or you weren't. There was a clarity to it Kirk had always appreciated. "Ready, Mr. Douglas?" The pilot called out, gesturing toward the rear passenger area. "You'll have more legroom back there." Kirk looked at the back seats, then at the front. The two young men were already moving toward the rear, assuming Kirk would take the co-pilot position if he wanted it. Something made him pause. Not a premonition, nothing so dramatic. Just a preference, a small choice in a morning full of small choices. He wanted to see forward. He wanted the unobstructed view. "I'll take the front," he said simply, and climbed into the co-pilot's seat. The two passengers settled behind him, their conversation muffled by the increasing noise of the rotor. Kirk buckled his seatbelt, adjusted his position, looked through the windshield at the sky beginning to lighten. The pilot ran through his final checks, called in to the tower, received clearance. The helicopter lifted smoothly, that stomach-drop sensation Kirk had felt 1,000 times, and then they were climbing, the airfield dropping away beneath them, the morning landscape spreading out in all directions. In the 7th minute, Kirk noticed the pilot lean forward slightly, his attention sharpening. Kirk followed his gaze and saw it. Another aircraft, small, a single-engine Pitts special aerobatic plane, approaching from their right. It seemed far enough away, but something about the way the pilot tensed made Kirk's own attention focus. The other plane was descending, its trajectory unclear. The pilot's hand moved to the radio, his voice calm but urgent as he tried to establish contact with the other aircraft. No response. The Pitts special kept coming, and Kirk realized with a strange detachment that it wasn't adjusting its course. The pilot was either not seeing them or not reacting, and there were only seconds to understand which. "Hold on," Kirk's pilot said, his voice tight, and he pulled hard on the collective, trying to climb above the oncoming plane. But physics and timing were working against them. The Pitts Special clipped the helicopter's main rotor with a sound Kirk would never forget, a metallic shriek that seemed to tear through the air itself. The helicopter lurched violently, the world spinning as the damaged rotor tried and failed to maintain lift. Kirk's hands gripped the edges of his seat as the aircraft began to fall, not straight down, but in a terrible spinning descent, the ground rushing up at them with sickening speed. The impact was chaos. Metal compressing, glass shattering, the tremendous force of deceleration happening all at once. Kirk felt something slam in his back, felt his head snap forward despite the seatbelt, felt pain explode across his body in a dozen places simultaneously. The helicopter hit the ground, bounced, hit again, and then there was a moment of terrible stillness. Kirk was conscious but disoriented, his vision swimming, his ears ringing with a high-pitched whine that drowned out everything else. He tried to move and felt sharp pain down his spine. His hand reached up, touched something wet on his head, came away red. He turned, slowly, fighting through the pain and confusion. The pilot next to him was slumped forward, unconscious but breathing. Kirk could see the rise and fall of his chest. Behind him, in the rear seats where Kirk had almost sat, where he would have been sitting if he had made a different choice 40 seconds earlier, there was only silence. The impact had been catastrophic in that section of the helicopter. The structure had collapsed inward. The force of the collision focused precisely where those two young men had been sitting. Kirk stared, his mind trying to process what he was seeing, trying to understand that he was alive and they were not, that the 40 seconds he had spent deciding where to sit had somehow determined who would survive this moment and who wouldn't. He would walk again, would eventually return to some version of his normal life. The pilot would survive as well, with injuries similar to Kirk's. The two young passengers in the rear seats, 24-year-old flight instructor Dan Fortney and 25-year-old student pilot Charles Peterson, were pronounced dead at the scene. The National Transportation Safety Board would later determine that the pilot of the Pitts Special, who also died in the crash, had failed to see and avoid the helicopter, a tragic error in judgment that cost 3 lives. No fault was assigned to Kirk's pilot. No fault was assigned to Kirk. It was, in the cold language of accident reports, a case of wrong place, wrong time, catastrophic outcome. But Kirk Douglas couldn't read it that way. Lying in his hospital bed, his body wrapped in bandages and braces, he kept returning to those 40 seconds. The pilot had suggested the rear seat. Kirk had chosen the front. That choice, that simple, unremarkable preference for a better view, had placed him in the section of the helicopter that remained relatively intact during the crash. If he had sat in the back, if he had accepted the pilot's suggestion, he would have been exactly where Dan Fortney and Charles Peterson were when the rotor was struck. The math was brutal and inescapable. The media called it a miracle. Headlines spoke of the legendary actor's narrow escape, his remarkable survival. Friends visited and expressed gratitude that he was alive. But Kirk couldn't feel grateful, not in the way people seemed to expect. He felt something else, something darker and more complicated. Why had he survived when two younger men, with whole lives ahead of them, had not? What cosmic equation had decided that his 74 years mattered more than their combined 49? He understood, intellectually, that his choice of seat hadn't killed them. The collision would have happened regardless. The Pitts Special would have struck the helicopter whether Kirk was in front or in back. But logic didn't ease the weight of being alive when others weren't. But the psychological recovery was something else entirely. That proved harder to quantify, harder to measure, impossible to therapy away. He thought about the families of Dan Fortney and Charles Peterson constantly. He wanted to reach out to them, to apologize even though he knew logically there was nothing to apologize for, to somehow acknowledge that their sons had died while he had lived. His lawyers advised against it. Any contact could be misinterpreted, could open legal complications. So Kirk stayed silent, and the silence felt like cowardice. He made anonymous donations to aviation safety organizations in their names. He established a small scholarship fund, but none of it felt adequate. None of it addressed the central question that haunted him. Why me? In interviews over the following years, Kirk spoke carefully about the crash. He acknowledged the trauma, the physical injuries, the long recovery. But he rarely talked about the guilt, the sense of having been spared when others weren't, the weight of carrying forward when others couldn't. That was private, something he kept locked away except in the darkest hours of night, when sleep wouldn't come and his mind returned, always returned, to those 40 seconds of decision. Then, in 1996, 5 years after the helicopter crash, Kirk suffered a severe stroke. He was in his bathroom when it hit, a sudden, devastating assault on his brain that left him unable to speak, unable to move the right side of his body. And found him collapsed, called for help, rode with him to the hospital where doctors worked to minimize the damage. Kirk survived, again, but this time the recovery was different. The stroke had affected his speech center, leaving him with severe aphasia. The man who had commanded Hollywood sets with his voice, who had delivered some of cinema's most powerful monologues, could barely form words. It was during this second recovery that something shifted. The speech therapist, a patient woman named Ellen who worked with him 3 times a week, noticed that Kirk seemed less present during their sessions, as if part of him was somewhere else. One afternoon, frustrated with an exercise that required him to name objects and photographs, Kirk suddenly stopped trying. He looked at Ellen and, with enormous effort, managed to say 3 words, not about words. Ellen waited. Kirk's face contorted with the effort of communication, his damaged brain struggling to find the pathways that would let him express what he was feeling. Finally, slowly, he said, "Helicopter. Boys. Dead." It was the first time since the crash that Kirk had articulated, out loud, the connection his mind had been making in private. Ellen, who knew his medical history, understood immediately. The stroke, devastating as it was, had given Kirk something the helicopter crash hadn't: forced silence. Unable to speak, unable to deflect or explain or intellectualize, Kirk was finally confronting the survivor's guilt he had carried for 5 years. Ellen adjusted their therapy. They still worked on speech, but she also encouraged Kirk to write, to draw, to find other ways of expressing what he couldn't say. Kirk began keeping a journal, his left hand forming shaky letters on the page, documenting not just his recovery, but his reckoning with survival. He wrote about Dan Fortney and Charles Peterson. He wrote about the 40 seconds. He wrote about the strange cruelty of living when others died, and the stranger grace of being given a second chance to understand what that meant. The full return of Kirk's speech took years, and even then it was never quite the same. He retained a slight slur, a hesitancy that hadn't been there before the stroke. But he learned to live with it, the same way he learned to live with the scars from the helicopter crash, the same way he learned to live with being 90 years old, then 95, then 100. Kirk Douglas became one of the oldest surviving stars of Hollywood's golden age, an ancient monument to a vanished era. In his later years, he spoke more openly about the crash. In a 2000 interview, he said, "I think about those 2 young men every day. I don't know why I lived, and they didn't. I don't think there is a why, but I've tried to make my survival mean something." He poured himself into philanthropy, donated millions to various causes, built playgrounds, and supported hospitals. He wrote books about aging, about survival, about the strange journey from immigrant poverty to Hollywood royalty to old man reflecting on a century of life. When asked directly if he felt guilty about surviving the helicopter crash, Kirk, then 98 years old, paused for a long time before answering. "Guilty isn't the right word," he finally said, his voice rough but clear. "Responsible, maybe. Responsible to live in a way that honors the fact that I got more time, and they didn't. I don't know if I succeeded, but I've tried." Kirk Douglas died in February 2020, at the age of 103. The obituaries focused on his legendary career, his powerful performances, his status as one of the last connections to Hollywood's golden age. Most mention the helicopter crash in passing, a notable event in a long and eventful life. Few dwelled on the psychological weight Kirk had carried from that morning in 1991, the burden of survivor's guilt that shaped his final decades. But those who knew him best understood that the 40 seconds Kirk spent deciding where to sit in that helicopter defined the last 29 years of his life more than any film role ever had. It taught him that survival isn't always a gift, that being alive when others aren't creates an obligation that can never be fully discharged. Kirk Douglas lived a full century, and then some, but part of him never left that crashed helicopter, never stopped asking why, never stopped feeling the weight of choices that seemed small until they meant everything. The sky Kirk wanted to see that morning remained beautiful and indifferent. The two young men who sat behind him became memories, lives unlived, potential unrealized. And Kirk Douglas, the survivor, carried them forward as best he could, for as long as he could, until finally, at 103, he too let go and followed them into whatever comes after the final 40 seconds run out.